Thanks everyone for coming. So Jeffrey Sachs is the director of the Earth Institute and professor of sustainable development and health policy and management at Columbia University. He's also special advisor to UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon on the Millennium Development Goals designed to reduce extreme poverty, disease, and hunger by the year 2015. He's been twice named among the 100 most influential leaders in the world by Time magazine and is sought worldwide for his economic advice and his unique capacity and global experience in complex economic problem solving. Today, he will be talking about his new book, The Price of Civilization. So please join me in welcoming Jeffrey Sachs.
Thanks, Stephanie. Hi, everybody. Pleasure to be back here, because each book I write, I get to come back to Google downtown, so it's a good incentive. That sounds funny. Okay. This book is about the U.S., and we're here at the center of American success. So you have a very particular view of the U.S. from the position of Google, one of the world's great companies, one of the most dynamic companies, and the leading sector of technological change. But the rest of the U.S. economy, or not the rest, but a lot of the U.S. economy is in a terrible mess, and a terrible financial, budget, and I claim moral crisis as well. So I have tried to write this book for myself to understand what is it that got the U.S., a company capable of producing a Google and others like Google, into a situation where Americans in general feel dreadful, where 80 to 90% of Americans feel that the country is way off track, where 91% of Americans disdain Congress, and I think the approval rating is about 9%, and where the police had to vacate the park down the road here early this morning, and we'll see whether a court order defends the First Amendment or whether we really have a country where you can't aggregate to protest anymore, because this isn't just about a park. This is about highly visible social protest, and I think it's dreadful that the police came in to move people out. Really shoddy behavior, and I hope the courts find it unconstitutional. So that's the puzzle that I think is the puzzle that is really before us. And as I was writing this book, I started with the financial crisis in 2008, and this is something pretty understandable, but it has antecedents, and the antecedents were the deregulation of the financial markets in the 1990s. That has antecedents in the deregulation of the financial markets in the 1980s, and I found myself going back to try to understand the story of U.S. change really from the 1970s onward, because I think the 1970s was a transition in American economic history and political history, as well as a transition in the world economy. From the end of World War II up through the end of the 1960s, America's economic dominance of the world was completely unquestioned. America's technological dominance of the world was completely unquestioned. America's geopolitical dominance of the world was questioned, only subject to the Cold War arms race, but not in any deeper way within the non-communist world. And that began to change in the 1970s. And I think that that's where one has to understand what has happened. In my view, what you are living and what the U.S. is living is a combination of a geopolitical and technological revolution that began in the 1970s. It's the combination of globalization and the digital revolution. Each one makes possible the other. Without the computer and digital age, there would have been no globalization the way we have it. and without globalization, the likes of Google would not really be conceivable in its current context. The 70s opened up the world of globalization economically, and it was a very unsettling decade for the whole world, including for the United States. In 1971, the exchange rate system that had dominated the world from the end of World War II until 1971 came to an end. It was called the Bretton Woods exchange rate system. It ended in August 1971. It set the world's currencies floating against each other. It was part of a decade of high inflation. In 1973, we had the first soaring oil price increases in a century, basically, when OPEC gained control of its oil stocks from the major oil companies. And in 1973, for a lot of reasons, monetary, resource base, and geopolitical, the oil prices increased roughly a factor of 4 times. And in the same year, 1973, there was a major El Nino, which was the first time we had a soaring rise of food prices. These are all preludes to things that are pretty common to us now. In the latter half of the 1970s, the US felt other parts of globalization, and most importantly, the manufacturing base of the United States started to be threatened by international competition for the first time. Japan was the leader of that. We had a lot of tumultuous trade negotiations at the end of the 1970s with Japan. And of course, in 1978, the biggest change of all in the world economy began, but under the radar screen entirely for roughly a decade, and that was the opening of China, which began with Deng Xiaoping's accession to power. That whole process of creating a global economy, in my opinion, has been preeminent in the huge dislocations that America has faced over the next 30 years. But the purpose of my book is to understand the interplay of those market forces with politics. And the politics that accompanied globalization began in 1981. And it is the combination, in my view, of a path that Ronald Reagan began and that became entrenched in this country for 30 years with globalization that really explains where we are today. So in 1981, President Reagan was elected, and on January 20th, 1981, he made a statement which I think is one of the most important statements of modern American political economy. One of the stupidest statements I know, but one of the most important statements as well. And the statement was that government is not the solution to our problems. Government is the problem. What Reagan was doing and what brought him to power was a claim. The claim was that the tumult of the 1970s, the high inflation, the oil price shocks, the slow growth, the high unemployment, the competition or the job losses, that all of that somehow reflected an overbearing government. It was not a hard sell for him in a lot of ways because a lot of the public was fixated on the war on poverty and the social programs of the 1960s, and the claim, which I view as wholly erroneous, that somehow those programs, the institution of Medicare, the implementation of other social policies, the war on poverty in its various aspects, was the element that led to the instability of the 1970s. And so the essence of restoring a sound economy for Reagan was to, quote, roll back government. It's a hypothesis that one would entertain in a graduate seminar or maybe a first-year economics class. I think that it is one that bears no relation to reality. on the substance of fiscal policy, on the magnitudes involved, on the possible pathways from this kind of these programs that Reagan attacked to actual outcomes, which in my view were almost wholly related to the changing structure of the world economy, the changing nature of technology, the integration of global production systems, the relative rise of other countries in the world economy, and so on. But Reagan made a diagnosis, and he had a political force behind him, which was mainly the rise of the Sun Belt and the backlash that was continuing to the civil rights era. And it was enough to squeak by in the 1980 election. He didn't quite squeak by. There were 3 candidates, but he just got a tiny majority, over 50% of the popular vote, and won a pretty solid vote of the electoral votes. Reagan started a process in this country that continues basically to this day, and that has proven to be impervious to change of administration, change of political party, and time. What Reagan started was a drastic cut of top tax rates for highest earning individuals and wealth holders. The rate came down from 70% top personal marginal tax rate to 28%. Then it was briefly lifted again. It's fluctuated in the 30s since then. It now is 35%. But that was Reagan's lasting contribution. Capital gains taxation and other categories like carried interest, which is applied to hedge funds and some other financial intermediaries, is at 15%. Capital gains tax rates now are 15%. They fluctuated, but the main thing that Reagan did was make a long-term, sustained, politically sustained transformation of the top tax rates in the country. At the same time, what he did was slash one major part of government, and that is government services and public investment. So we have 3 kinds of government programs at the federal level. We have our war machine, which we call the defense budget, and I call the offense budget most of the time. And that is about 1/3 of the budget. We have the entitlements programs or the transfer programs, which are Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, veterans benefits, and food stamps as the predominant ones. And those are another 5 or 6% of GDP, roughly the same. I'm sorry, the Medicare and Medicaid's about 5% of GDP, Social Security about 5% of GDP, the military about 5% of GDP, and then veterans and food stamps another 2 to 3 percentage points of GDP. Then we have a third category of programs, which are all the public services, the direct provision by government of services, whether it's things like job training or education, Pell Grants, National Science Foundation, NASA, transportation, highway system, and so on. Environment, all of the Interior Department programs, energy systems, and so on that the federal government maintains. Reagan tried to cut the transfer programs and failed. George Bush Jr. tried to cut the transfer programs and failed. They more or less continued on as mostly as programmed, with some expansion of coverage, but mainly rising costs of health care and rising coverage because of an aging population. Since the 1960s, there's been little dent of that part of the budget. The military has tended to vary depending on which wars we're in, from somewhere between 3 and 6% of GDP, and we're at about 5% of GDP right now, not so much different from when Reagan was in office. The part where Reagan succeeded in his goal of rolling back government was this civilian discretionary, or the non-security discretionary budget. And that was cut roughly by half as a share of national income from the time that Reagan came in till the end of Reagan's administration and roughly till now. And this has been, in my view, one of the decisive and lasting elements of American reality that probably is on par with the cuts of the tax rates. So Reagan, the Reagan Revolution, which has been 30 years of persistence, has had three successful, sustained elements, successful in terms of the objectives of the authors of this revolution. One was a deep and persistent cut of top tax rates. The second was a massive deregulation of the financial industry, of broadcasting and media, and substantially of the environment. So significant deregulation. And the third were sharp cuts that have lasted in the non-security discretionary budget of the United States. We've now done this for 30 years. The reason I wrote this book is that I think it's a disaster, what's come out of this. And I just want to show you a little bit of the reality of this, and then I'm going to turn it open to questions. Of course, one of the things that happened is a remarkable widening of inequality in the United States that began in 1981. You see that we have a U-shaped income distribution measured as the share of the top 1% of households in household income. It reached a peak in 1929 when the top 1% of households in an era of unregulated speculation and the tax cuts and other policies of the Harding, Coolidge, Hoover decade of the 1920s brought the share of the top 1% to about 24% of total household income. Then came the Great Depression, World War II, the New Deal, very steep increases of top tax rates, and you see that there were about 3 decades where that flat line at the bottom of the U shows that the top 1% of households had a share of the income of about 10%, 9 to 11% of total household income. Reagan came in 1981, and that's exactly, in fact, when this curve starts to increase. There were many parts of it. Globalization would have already driven some inequality. We know that because this curve turns up in just about every high-income country in the world. But it's the United States that has by far the biggest increase, because it's really only in the United States that government amplified the forces of globalization to lead to this remarkable surge of incomes and, I should say, wealth at the top. The bottom line is, in red, is the share of the top 0.01% of households. We have 120 million households in the United States, so 0.01% is 12,000 households. Those 12,000 households take in about 5% of total household income, and that is more than the bottom 24 million households in the United States. So we have quite deeply entrenched poverty at the bottom and extraordinary wealth at the top. What happened in the middle is quite notable, and that's shown on the right-hand side. This is the median earnings of full-time year-round male workers. They peaked in 1973, which is a really astounding, surprising feature of the U.S. economy. It's been 38 years since we reached the peak of the median male worker. For women workers, the picture's different. It's continued to rise from much lower levels than men, and also, and for two reasons which are hard to disentangle, at least hard for me to disentangle. One is that women faced massive discrimination, which has gradually eased. And the second is that women are in the non-traded goods sector of the economy to a much higher extent than men. So male median workers, who are basically high school grads, face the decline of the tradable sector in response to globalization. The peak employment in manufacturing in the United States occurred in 1979, when we reached 19 million workers in manufacturing. And since then, it's come down to about 10 million. So men faced a sharp decline in the sectors where men predominate, whereas women are more in the service sector, which is mainly a sheltered sector up to this point vis-a-vis international trade. And so somehow the combination of reducing discrimination and less impact of globalization has meant that women's median earnings have continued to rise a bit, whereas male earnings peaked already in 1973. I think that these two pictures basically depict the American phenomenon pretty clearly, and that is that the combination of globalization and Reaganomics has meant stagnation in the middle, soaring wealth at the top, and deepening poverty at the bottom, other than for the elderly. And recent statistics suggest that the poverty of the elderly may be more than is conventionally captured by the standard poverty rates. Now, in normal countries, of which the US is not one, government actually acted to do something about these increasing tensions in national economies facing a very radically changed global economy. And the main response that one would like to see in response to globalization is rising skills accumulation and helping all parts of the society to gain a foothold in remunerative work. One of the facts of globalization has been a sharp widening of the wage education gradient. I think I have a picture. Wait a minute. Yeah. Nope. Education or earnings have risen only for those with bachelor's degrees and above on average in the United States. And so one of the responses that one would have wanted is an upgrading of educational attainment and skills attainment. The conventional way would be a higher throughput of college graduates. Probably there are new, creative, unconventional ways with different kinds of skills qualifications, but on essentially all counts that we can measure, the United States has stagnated in the educational attainments, both in terms of raw numbers like proportions completing a 4 years bachelor's degree, and has stagnated also in effective training of certificate programs or more focused post-high school skill programs. And we have the irony of very high unemployment and a huge shortage in the US economy of what you guys do. It's very hard to hire programmers, you know that, and it's very hard to hire them at what I would call reasonable salaries, you know that too. And that's one of the facts of our economy, which is that globalization has given a premium to skills. It's given a premium to educational attainment. It's given a premium to various kinds of skill attainment. But the throughput of the US education system it's budged, but it's barely budged in the process. And what other governments did in Northern Europe, which are the countries that I most admire, countries like Korea, which have been most successful in rapid catching up into becoming high-income countries. The government invested very heavily in the whole life cycle of education and human capital development from preschool and early childhood development all the way through university. The United States did the opposite, basically. We've been cutting spending in this area. There's lots of political economy why that is, but that's the path that Reagan set us on. So a summary that I think is a fair summary is that all high-income countries experienced rising inequality and job loss in the manufacturing sector in response to globalization and technological change from the 1980s onward. The United States is the country that has ended up with the biggest inequality, the biggest underclass, the most dug-in poverty, and the least public response to this challenge up until now. And almost nothing has changed the direction of actual policies for 30 years. So let me just show you the upshot of this. This is, for me, the essence of our Washington problem. We have many other problems in this country, but this is our Washington problem. Our Washington problem is that we have lots of important things to do that we need to do collectively. Actually, not almost, a very dirty word in the United States. The idea that we should do things together as a society. But there are public goods and public services, and they're vital for a couple of reasons. One, markets don't provide these goods and services adequately. And second, poor people can't avail themselves of these goods and services without help. Education is a classic example of this, already recognized by Adam Smith as an area of society where the government needs to play an important role. So these are all the categories of our non-security discretionary budget, the part I mentioned that Ronald Reagan slashed. It includes legislature and the court system, agriculture, commerce, the education department, which I think 2/3 of the Republican candidates want to eliminate entirely, the energy department, which would be responsible for actually helping America to make a transformation to a low-carbon future, something that we have no interest in doing, it seems, at the moment. Public health, affordable housing, which we left to Wall Street rather than to government policy. The Interior Department, which is, of course, our public lands management, Justice Department, Labor Department, which is job training, active labor market programs, transport, which would mean high-speed rail if we happen to live in China, but means Amtrak if you live in the United States, which is no speed rail half the time, Environmental Protection Agency, NASA, and so on. So here's what has happened to all of that. As I said, Reagan came in, and if you look all the way on the left, that sum of activities was between 5% and 6% of national income at the end of the 1970s. Too small, low compared to other countries, because we do very little in labor market policy. We do very little for early childhood development. We give no family support to speak of in this country, or almost no family support. We don't do housing policy and so on, other than the crazy way that blew up through Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and subprime mortgages, because we don't do direct budget outlays as other countries do. But we were doing 5% to 6%. Then Reagan came, and you see the collapse of the discretionary programs as a share of national income down to about 2.5%. It continued all the way through every administration. There's really very little difference between Democrats and Republicans in this country in terms of what they really mean when they're in office, because the more fundamental politics is much more dug in than the yakking on the cable news shows. And the basics of the Reagan era, low tax rates at the top, low spending for public goods and services, and deregulation has been a constant not a partisan variable. This continued up through 2009. You see this little spike, which is, in my view, one of the more useless things our country has tried to do. That's called the stimulus legislation. The idea of the stimulus legislation was we have a crisis, we should jolt the economy back to normal. The mistake of that concept is that the economy wasn't normal. The economy was in structural transformation, not in short-term business cycle crisis. And a temporary jolt is pretty useless, and that's what came out of the stimulus, very little. We had a blip, it came back down, and what you can see, which I find to be the most alarming single fact of our politics today, something that's almost unremarked upon, I would add, in our political life, is that what Congress and the White House have agreed to in August is that this category of the budget should be capped at a rate of increase lower than inflation, so that the share of this spending relative to national income will continue to decline, so that all those things that I mentioned, the environment, science, training, education, affordable housing, the justice system, all of that, transport, will be less than 2% of national income. That's the trajectory we're on. So we're basically closing down government, other than those big buildings on Constitution Avenue, if you happen to go to Washington for some strange reason. And there is no reason to go to Washington, except if you want to lobby for tax breaks, or you're a tourist to see those big buildings and wonder what they do inside. Because actually, they don't do anything anymore. And that's the whole idea of this country. We want just those big buildings, the Interior Department, great, Labor Department, fascinating. And we even have a debate. Should we have them? Shouldn't we have them? They could be turned into giant Starbucks or something. That's where we really are. So my view is that we have a very, very deep structural crisis in this country. We have half the population not making it and feeling the pull of poverty. We have people like you and Google making it, and making it quite spectacularly. So we have a dual economy. The luxury industry is booming right now. The money at the top is booming. Corporate profits are booming. You have plenty of tax privileges to keep those corporate profits as well. The share of taxation of corporate income as a percent of national income is basically a historic low at this point. The corporate sector is only paying 1.5% of GNP in corporate taxes because you're able to book the profits overseas, keep them overseas at effectively almost zero taxation. And we're told that the only thing we can do in this country is follow this curve down to oblivion, which is the path that I think we're on if we continue this way. And that's more or less the bipartisan consensus. So the Republicans would like to slash further. Right now we're collecting about 15% of GDP in federal taxation. Maybe we'd get back to 17% of GDP with the full business cycle recovery, if such a concept is even meaningful anymore. The Republican plans are more or less to try to stabilize at 15% of GDP. You think about what that means from a budgetary point of view. The military right now is 5, Social Security is 5, Medicare, Medicaid is 5. That's 15 already. Interest on the debt is going to be 2 to 3. That makes 17.5 or 18%. And all of this stuff, which I call government, that's all on borrowed money. And they just want to close down as much of that as possible. The Democrats basically disagree with that, kind of. but mainly Democrats are the party of hand-wringers. We know we need to cut, it's terrible, and to wring their hands and to agree on the cuts. And the Republicans are the happy party. We're going to cut. We're going to cut 6 departments. I can't remember what they are. I know it's whatever it is. Yeah, I don't care what it is. It could be Interior, EPA. Yeah, fine. It doesn't matter. They can't wait to solidify this income distribution. That's the whole goal right now on the Republican side. Make this income inequality permanent, put it off bounds of politics, institute a philosophy in this country of Ayn Rand that not only do you have no right to ask anybody for anything, if a rich person gives something, they're just demeaning and debasing themselves. That's Ayn Rand's philosophy. Not only is there no right, not only is there no responsibility, anything that reeks of a contribution of rich and powerful to the rest of society is a debasement of human values. It's the worst perversion of philosophy that I know that is taken seriously by a segment of the American population. And the Democrats don't have the firepower and the stamina to resist any of it. Fundamentally, both political parties are taking campaign contributions from the top 1%. They're taking campaign contributions from the major corporations now after Citizens United. Obama doesn't have the guts to fight this. I don't think he wants to fight it necessarily, but he doesn't have really the guts or the stamina to fight it. And the Republicans are not only not fighting it, this is the whole purpose of the modern Republican Party. And so I think it's likely that we're going to continue on this kind of trajectory with a meaner and more divided society unless there's a break in the politics. And from a programmatic level, I don't think it's too complicated what to do. And my view is that we need to tax several percent of GDP more in order to be able to expand spending on education, on early childhood development, on science and technology, on low carbon energy systems, on other environmental protection. We simply don't have the means right now in government to be able to fund basic public goods and services and public investments to modernize the economy and to make sure that we have an inclusive society. So I think we need probably about 4 percentage points of GDP more on the tax side as a minimum. And I recommend a steep increase of top marginal tax rates. I recommend a wealth tax on very high net worth, above $5 million, a 1% net worth tax. I recommend basically removing the deferral privileges of companies on their offshore profits, because this deferral is really an invitation to serial amnesties, quote unquote, like the one that we're working up to now, that companies park their profits abroad, they wait a few years, they're able to bring them back, and we're essentially in a system where we've gutted the corporate tax rate. And so I think we should claim at least a percentage point more in corporate taxation, at least a percentage point more in income taxation, a percentage point more of GDP in net worth taxation, and then there are a handful of other taxes and simply enforcement of the tax laws, which by itself is estimated would yield at least another percentage point of GDP. But I favor a carbon tax, I favor a financial transactions tax, and I favor stiffer enforcement of our tax code. And the sum, in my view, could realistically increase revenues by 4 to 5 percentage points of GDP and give us a chance to avoid this decline to what I think would be a society of locked-in poverty inequality, and increasing unrest. Now, neither political party comes close to supporting this. Paul Ryan officially declared my book un-American and contrary to the principles of the Founding Fathers. I officially declared him a hack politician who is on the take of David Koch and has few scruples of any sort that I've been able to notice. But when you do the basic arithmetic, either we eliminate government and we slash programs for the poor, which is the Republican platform, or we just gradually asphyxiate government, which is the program of Obama, or we change direction and admit that we can't pay for civilization with the tax system that we have right now, which has a vote of 1 so far, but actually more than 1, because I think that the Occupy Wall Street movement is just on target, in fact. It may be a little inchoate to the lazy pundits in our mainstream media. They may not like painted faces. They may not like kids sleeping in tents. But the truth of the matter is that the Occupy movement is the first social response in this country to a reality that's been underway for 30 years, is serious, real, and almost completely unreflected in our politics. My view, moreover, which I expressed in an op-ed piece in the Sunday New York Times this past Sunday, was that the Occupy movement in the end is actually going to prove to be something real, more than a sleep in the park. It's really going to prove to be a turning point. Because this picture, while it's possible, it's dreadful. And if it happens, America will be a lot worse than any of us wants to imagine as a society. And I think there's a growing realization of this, though not at all yet in our public rhetoric. Our political rhetoric is going to go one more notch of slashing government probably in the next month or two with this super committee. And par for the course, it's being done behind closed doors. It's just the antithesis of democracy, in my view, everything that's going on. And Obama's role is the antithesis of leadership, in my opinion. And he's the guy I support and voted for, mind you. I just find him a profound disappointment in how he's governing. So I think that there is a change that is possible, vital, and I'll just end with what it means if it comes about. I analogize our current situation to roughly where we were 100 years ago, maybe fair to say 115 years ago, when the progressive movement started in the United States. There was a massive financial crisis, in fact, in 1893, and that's what brought Williams Jennings Bryan to his famous campaign pledge that we will not be crucified on a cross of gold. And that was the beginning of the progressive movement at the national level, in fact. The progressives actually got their president with Teddy Roosevelt after McKinley's assassination. And Roosevelt brought in an era of quite basic reform that tamed the financial industry, ended up creating the Fed, ended up creating the graduated income tax, created fair labor standards, strengthened antitrust legislation. In other words, made a lot of campaign finance reforms also, all of which, like an arms race, get beaten by new loopholes and exceptions, but in the early years of the 20th century played an important role. Woodrow Wilson was the second great progressive president, and he presided over the introduction of a number of the constitutional amendments, also the direct election of senators and women's suffrage, which were all part of the progressive era. I think this is like where we are right now. That movement took 20 years. It's not something that happens overnight. It doesn't happen by a walk in the park. That's kind of an opening shot. But I think that this basic idea of the U.S. experiencing fundamental socio-political change is real. It's happened 3 times in the last century: the Progressive Movement, the New Deal, and the 1960s. I'm old enough to have seen that one. It was fun. It was exciting. It was transformative. It created civil rights and women's rights. It opened up society a lot. It stuck with me. And I think that that's what we're going to begin to see now. Thanks very much. Please.
Yeah, I guess it's a little weird. I graduated from high school the year before the peak in 1973. But
You're a 72 grad?
yeah.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
Okay.
But there's something I've had this really strong impression ever since then, okay, in that I remember before getting out of high school, and perhaps it was just I was a kid, but I used to listen to politicians debate stuff, and I remember always being a Democrat. I remember thinking the Republicans are wrong, but they've got good arguments, and what they're saying is reasonable. They're just wrong, okay? I mean, people are sometimes wrong,
right,
and they were consistently wrong. But the farther I've gotten from sort of getting out of high school, the more and more when I look to that side, I say, no, it's not that they're wrong. They're just disconnected from reality. This stuff doesn't even make sense. It's not what I'm being taught in school. It's not what's in the economics books. It's not what's in history books. It's just totally disconnected from reality. And so I guess the question I would ask here is, maybe you've told us what happened, okay? But why?
Yeah.
How has this been possible? And for goodness sakes, particularly here when we talk about the median income, the vast majority of the American people are being totally screwed by this process. And they're being told on a regular basis that they are being screwed. They're being given this voodoo economics and ridiculous economics, just insanity. Lafleur and everybody who came after him, people who were like discredited the moment they came out. Yet the sort of how can I say this? The nonsensical side of this debate has been given tremendous respect and tremendous following ever since it began. How in the world could this have happened? And how in the world do we fight what appears to be a completely irrational opposition?
Yeah, I think of course, I put most of the blame on my side, maybe your side, which is the being so ineffective in responding to this. And I would say the Democrats got deeply corrupted in this process. So when I listen to them, I just see rot rather than I see something a little bit more rational. But this stimulus, for example, I thought that was a preposterous response to America's real challenges. That's my side. What are we packaging within 4 weeks? A $900 billion mess, and calling that policy. And I said to President Obama that that is the kind of thing that gets you in trouble, because you prove that you're not a steward of the American people's income. It's just seems to be throwing money at problems. And I argued with my former colleague Larry Summers about this. I disagree strongly with Paul Krugman about this. I think the American people look at both sides and they don't understand either side. The Republicans do seem to most Americans to be absolutely antithetical to their values, and the American people have it pretty well pegged that the Republican Party is in the interests of the rich and the super rich, and that's what the opinion surveys show, and the people get it. But they don't find the Democrats giving any answers. And so the sad part of this is that it was Clinton who brought Robert Rubin into the White House. Why we had to have the chairman of Goldman Sachs come in as Treasury Secretary, lead deregulation, end Glass-Steagall, and then go be number 2 at Citigroup. On my side, I don't know, but that's inappropriate. And so the Democrats are deeply tarnished. Why you have a financial crisis and Obama brings in Summers, who had presided over this deregulation 10 years ago, brings in everybody from the investment banks, and every single senior person in the White House has come from an investment bank, basically. That's my side. So I don't think that there's a great alternative on offer right now. The Republicans, I agree with you, it's la-la land, except they know what they're doing. You know, they're playing on a lot of ignorance and propaganda, but this whole anti-climate change thing, for example, this is David Koch, this is the oil industry, this is Rupert Murdoch, this is sheer game. This isn't a science debate, this is pure corporate propaganda, period. And they're good at it, because they got Roger Ailes at Fox News, who was Nixon's image maker. You know, they know how to do this kind of propaganda. But our side doesn't pick up, my side. And so I have to say we got one far-right party and we've got one center-right party. And we've got the rest of America scratching their heads saying, we don't like Washington because nobody's representing us. And that, to my mind, is the biggest problem. That, you know, one side is really, as I say, and I think you feel it the same way, from a moral point of view, completely ununderstandable from the perspective of the most just modicum of decency, compassion, basic standards of values. But the other side's dishonest.
But if what you're saying is right, look, I spent most of my youth growing up overseas, in places like, you know, Ethiopia during revolutions, and,
yep.
and in Berlin when the Russians were. When the government becomes that disconnected from the people,
yep.
okay, as you
it
seem
is
to
the
be
right
suggesting,
and the duty
okay,
of the public to
sorry, there's only
overturn it.
There is
the
really
expression.
only one thing that inevitably happens, and that is not just people sitting in the park, but that is violence. How do we avoid that?
Well, you know, my belief is that we've had, I hope we do, I think that the path that we're on is incredibly dangerous. And I think the way we avoid it most likely is to come together around a set of practical proposals, a platform, and elect candidates that are going to carry that out. Our structural problem is that our politicians on both sides are on the take. And so they're not offering the median voter answer. They're happy in their duopoly on the right of keeping taxes low and slashing the rest of government. And that's kind of a safe, comfortable, incumbent duopoly that is not capturing the center. I think a good political entrepreneur who's clever could capture the center and capture power, or a political movement could do so. The trick is big money can't do that and won't do that. So my view structurally is that the solution is, how do you run and win power without campaign contributions? That, to my mind, is the real structural challenge. And my view is that it's possible these days. If everyone's got their Androids, if everyone's tweeting, if everyone is using YouTube and Facebook and every social network, what we ought to do is create a platform that is the free campaign platform, the whole social media platform. You have a message, we'll retweet it 1 million times in a day. We'll make sure that videos go viral. We'll use a Facebook network that's created of a nationwide friends of progressive ideas, and enable candidates to run without being on the take. So that's the revolution in campaign tactics that I think could be the breakthrough. And then if the platform is right, then I think the rest can follow. That's my strategy. What do you think? You ready?
The internet will set you free?
Yes. What do you think, guys? You're Google. All right.
If only,
can you guys
let's hope it
make the
happens.
right platform? Google.democracy.org. All right. We may tax you a little bit more in the meantime also, but.
Jeffrey, thank you for being here, and thank you for showing all these graphs. You talked about your admiration for the Northern European countries and Korea in particular. So would you be able to, I mean, I don't know if you have the information here, but would you be able to share some of those, some of those graphs or?
Yeah. Let me just show you one thing.
Thank you.
Yeah. Actually, let me show you one thing. We watch a lot of TV in this country. That's a little bit of a distraction, but I think it actually is part of our distraction as well. The countries that I really like are on the, well, Italy, that's interesting. But, okay, let me show you the, here's the big difference of what happened in this country and what happened in the rest of, in other places. So basically, on the left-hand side is the change, arithmetic change of the tax to GNP ratio, comparing 2008 minus 1965, okay? So it's the rise of the tax share of national income. And you can see that every high-income country has higher tax collections as a share of GNP than in the mid-1960s, except for one country. That's us, all the way at the end. We're the only country that resisted raising revenues in this country. That's the whole story that I'm talking about. We decided we're not going to pay for government. Everyone else pays for government. And the social democracies they were already high and they had big increases. The result is that the United States, for example, just in one category, social spending, this includes some of the transfer programs, we have the lowest level of social spending of any country. This is basically Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, food stamps. Sweden, Denmark, Belgium, Austria, France, they're 10 percentage points of GDP higher than we are. The countries that I really admire most in their performance are Netherlands, Sweden, Finland, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, Netherlands, Germany. In general, they're spending about 10 percentage points of GDP more than the United States. They're taxing about 15 percentage points of GDP more than the United States because they also don't run a budget deficit. So they're spending a lot and they're paying their way. And life is really nice in those countries, by the way. There's no poverty. Everybody gets 5 or 6 weeks paid vacation. Of course, it's paid within the context of their jobs and the state. Everybody gets maternity and paternity leave for several months. Nobody gets super rich. There's some inherited wealth, but nobody gets super rich. That's the price that they pay. That's what they want, which is a society of high affluence, very superb education, very competitive industries, internationally competitive industries, highly innovative. They pay a lot of government spending for the innovation. So Sweden invests very heavily of public funds as well as having companies like Ericsson and others that are doing private sector innovation. And they pay for it basically by, our taxes are right now 27% of GDP. In the normal time before 2008, our taxes were about 30% of GDP. Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Finland, Netherlands, about 45% of GDP. It's a whole different environment. The main difference, by the way, is that in those countries, there's a lot of support for families. There's daycare. There's maternity leave. There's help for low-skilled households. there's early childhood development support. There's more investment for poor children in schooling. They don't let anyone fall away. And the result is evident when you live there, as I have in Sweden, or when you visit, which is infrastructure is very well maintained, education levels are uniformly high, there are no pockets of poverty, and there's very high social mobility. Whereas, by the way, the other shocking thing about the United States, let me show you one more graph, and I'm going to have to stop also, and I know you do as well. This is a graph showing the correlation of parental educational attainment and children's educational attainment in the OECD countries. So a high correlation means that, of course, that highly educated parents raise children who end up with high educational attainment. Low educated parents end up the opposite. The countries over on the left with the lowest correlation, or as shorthand, very high educational mobility intergenerationally, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Canada. The United States actually has the highest intergenerational correlation at this point. So we pride ourselves as being highly socially mobile. But if you're born to a family where your parents don't have a high school degree, the chance that you're going to graduate bachelor's degree in this country, probably under 10%. You just can't make it. The combination of the poverty, the lack of social support, the neighborhood factors, the intrafamilial factors, the high tuition rates. So this is why we're ending up really as the most stratified of all of these countries, because we don't invest in any of this equalization. And that, I think, is going to be our killer. The data just came out. If you're a Hispanic young man in this country, 25 to 29, only 11% have a bachelor's degree. African American young man, 25 to 29, 16%. In this society, in a world economy, what kind of incomes, jobs, life prospects does that mean? Very poor, very unstable, very erratic. And, you know, some people say that's fine. But I think what it's going to mean for the corrosion of our society is extremely serious. And I think the process has already begun. And it wouldn't take a revolution to correct this. It would just take a few percent of GDP to correct it. That's the beauty of it. And the question is, are we going to wait till there is an explosion? Or are we actually going to correct it? I was reading last night about the bonus army in the Great Depression when the veterans were demanding some help in 1932. Hoover sent in the troops, and many people were killed and wounded. And then in 1933, they struck again, and Roosevelt sent Eleanor Roosevelt to the camp. And she discussed and negotiated with them, and they made a program so that the veterans would get jobs in the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps. And the line that came out of it was, Hoover sent the troops and FDR sent his wife. And it's the kind of society we want. If we're clearing the parks with police with batons, we're going to end up in the Hoover world. And if we send the Eleanor Roosevelts of the world and try to figure out something, we're going to end up with some decency. Thank you very much.